Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Patrick Hughes, and I am Head of Export Trade Development for potatoes here at AHDB. I'd like to welcome you along to this webinar today entitled Potatoes and Brexit, Exploring the Impact of No Deal. During this session, we will offer information to help prepare potato growers, importers and exporters for Brexit, and to offer insight into what lies ahead of us in a post-Brexit world. Today's webinar, we will cover Brexit planning from a business perspective, EU exit and international trade, planning for the end of transition, and the action and pre-planning steps exporters and importers need to take to ensure compliance. But first, to a bit of housekeeping. I'd like to remind everyone that the event will be recorded and links to the recording will be sent out after the webinar. Questions can be raised during the event using the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. We will address one or two questions after each presentation and then open up to a wider Q&A session after we have heard the final presentation. We aim to address every question posted. However, if we are unable to answer a question directly or we simply run out of time, we will endeavour to seek questions for the answers posted we will seek answers to the questions posted and circulate after the event. So I'd like to introduce our panel of speakers for today. Firstly, we will hear from Sandy McGowan of Signet Pep, who are leading exporters of Scottish seed potatoes. Sandy is also the current president of the BPTA. Well, hopefully Sandy was one president who had a decent night's sleep last night, and Sandy will present on the challenges facing businesses in the run-up to the end of the transition period. Secondly, we will see and hear from Emily Rhodes. Emily is EU Exit and International Trade Advisor for the NFU. Today, Emily will present on the practicalities of EU exit, future international trade, and cover planning for the end of the transition period. Finally, I will cover what actions and pre-planning steps exporters and importers need to take to ensure compliance. We will also be joined in our final Q&A panel by two of our key speakers from yesterday's webinar. Tania Gesto-Casas, who is AHDB's EU Policy Manager, and Sarah Baker, who is Senior Strategic Insight Manager at AHDB, are primed to answer any questions at the conclusion of our presentations. So once again, just a reminder that you can post questions at any point during the webinar using the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. And now I'd like to pass over to Sandy and hear about Brexit planning from a business perspective. Sandy.
Thanks, Patrick. Yeah, I can confirm that with a 4-year-old daughter at home who thinks sleep's underrated, I didn't have a great night's sleep as president last night, but it has nothing to do with any election. Thank you, first of all, for asking me to present today. As you say, I am currently the British Potato Trade Association president, as well as a manager of Signet Pep, which is, as Patrick pointed out, one of the leading exporters of UK, but more specifically Scottish seed potatoes. So what I'm going to try and do, just very briefly, and without going into a huge amount of detail, because I'm going to leave that to the experts later on, just the steps that we as a business are taking as exporters of seed potatoes with the Brexit transition period coming to a close. So if we move on to my next slide, please. Just a brief overview to give you a bit of background about Signet Pep. As I've said, a leading exporter of Scottish seed potatoes. The images to the side of the text here show the various territories and countries that Signet Pep are involved in around the world. Most of these countries are supplied directly from the UK with Scottish seed. A number, obviously, as you can see, are also licensed agreements for the production of proprietary varieties from our breeding programme, which is we have exclusive rights to manage with Signet Potato Breeders. With that in mind, Signet Pep's a joint venture business. We specialise in exports. We aren't involved at all in the UK and Ireland, which means that Brexit is particularly pertinent to what we do on a daily basis. The joint venture started 8 years ago between the UK's largest breeding company, Signet Potato Breeders, and Pan-European Potatoes. To probably oversimplify the reasoning, we very much felt we had the genetics and the expertise in terms of varieties to tackle export markets, whereas the other half of the business had the marketing and the contacts without perhaps the genetics and expertise behind that. So the two marry together very nicely. Current position of where we are as Signet Pep is we supply around 28,000 tonnes annually of basic grade seed potatoes, as in class elite or higher. As most people on the webinar will know, we can't certify any lower than that in Scotland, and that's one of the strengths of what we do. So we don't have a class A or class B like you can achieve in England or more specifically across the European Union. That gives us a competitive advantage. In some terms, it's also a bit of a disadvantage when some of our competitor nations, such as Holland, are able to still export Class A. But for sure, it means that we have this high health status in Scotland. Signet Pep work with around about 43 Scottish-based growers, and we're in around 45 export markets, which is direct supply of seed from Scotland, so containers leaving port in the UK and arriving in port in the destination country. As I've already alluded to, we have multiple license agreements for Scottish bred proprietary varieties across the world, which you can kind of pick out from our map there. So with regards to Brexit, we supply straight into a number of European Union customers and in some cases growers as well, across the different sectors of our industry: processing, mainly crisp and French fry, fresh market, and also seed multiplication, where Scottish elite grade is actually seen as a very high health, high quality input for a number of our European neighbours, given that they have so much certified seed in their systems. So there's a 4-year programme of multiplication that goes into anything that we set in motion from Signet Pep, which obviously then means that the Brexit implications of the end of the transition period have a wider ranging impact than just a one and done in terms of production. And 15% of my production in Scotland goes to EU markets. So a not insignificant tonnage is already, we're looking for ways and means of working our way around the Brexit issue as it stands today. So if we move on to the next slide, the image is pretty self-explanatory. For lack of a better description, and having spoken to a number of others in the industry in my role as BPTA president, we are staring off the edge of a cliff here with Brexit in terms of seed potato exports, potato exports in general to the European Union. At the end of the transition period, which is the 31st of December at 11 PM UK time, we become a third country. That third country status means that we have no access to the European Union market. Now, that's very different to a number of other seed products or products in general. There is a special clause and annex within the European Union rules, European Commission rules, I should say, that seed potatoes fall under, and where potatoes fall under, that excludes the trade and the supply of these products. So without third country equivalence, there is no market into the EU. So it goes overnight. Third country equivalence was applied for post the Brexit referendum. DEFRA hold the power to do this on our behalf, and they made the application fairly hastily and in the correct manner. It has been acknowledged by the European Commission that they've received this application. We have pushed as BPTA, we have pushed as Signet Pep, we have pushed as the representative of, supply a number of our European agents and customers from a European side to have the ratification process at least acknowledged and started. But until now, the Standing Committee for Plant Health and European Commission have not tabled any third country equivalence application from the UK in any of their meetings. So as it stands, we do not have third country equivalence, and therefore we cannot continue to trade after the transition period completes, unless, of course, there's a deal pulled out the hat. We don't actually know if that's going to happen. We don't actually know if they're going to start looking at that after the transition periods ends in January 2021. But we have to assume that once the Brexit is complete, as we keep getting told, that it will get looked at. But again, unfortunately, we don't know exactly how long that'll take. It feels a little bit like seed potatoes and ware potatoes in particular are being used as a bit of a political pawn within wider issues within the Brexit discussions. One thing we can say that is positive in this part is the UK signed off a 6-month extension for the import of European Union seed into England and Wales. Of course, we have a voluntary ban in Scotland for bringing seed in outside of the Scottish High Health area. That was signed off by the 4 ministers of Scotland, England, Northern Ireland and Wales yesterday, so that is now agreed and in place. I don't know the exact details, and I know that Patrick's maybe going to cover that a little bit more in depth later on. So that was seen as an olive branch was being extended to the European Commission, that we were going to allow the imports, and it was hoped that that would be reciprocated. Until now, there's been no acknowledgement or no referral to it being reciprocated in the short term. However, there are, of course, the additional issues of, as I've said multiple times, third country equivalence, and is it as easy as just extending the European Union and European Commission rules? Unfortunately, this part is completely out with our hands in the UK, and more importantly, from my own point of view, out of the hands of Signet Pep and my suppliers. If we move on to the next slide. That leaves us with the cliff edge scenario, as I've said, but we can't just sort of muddle on regardless and hope things get sorted out. So in the short term, we've been planning for this since the Brexit announcement. We've had a number of internal meetings, both at management and operational level, and for sure the picture's changed multiple times. But we are now really running down the clock and approaching D-Day to a certain extent. So where we have to go with this, deliveries have to be into Europe before the 31st of the 12th, 2020 at midnight. Of course, that's EU time. That free in circulation that I've put in inverted commas in the presentation there, that relates to the fact that the seed must be in Europe and sold in inverted commas again, i.e. we must have a customer end user for this seed. We cannot just load it into Europe and have it stored in cold store. It can then be transferred through multiple sets of hands and multiple merchants, as often happens with seed potatoes, until it reaches its final destination. But of course, that does mean that we have to load these trucks out of Scotland before the end of December, which is a fairly unusual prospect for most of our customers. Moving on to the customers, while we have lived and breathed Brexit since the referendum, and since the transition period really kicked in the end of January 2020, a number of European-based businesses are still really unaware of the complete Brexit implications, and we as Signet Pep are still fielding calls daily from customers of customers and growers asking what it means for certain varieties, for deliveries, and how they have to handle them. Really, the misinformation and the misunderstanding of what is out there, and I think the lack of clarity is quite incredible. So we have been taking steps to make sure all our customers are aware of what is going on, but even at this stage we're still having to tweak some of our plans with individuals to make sure it's hopefully going to land okay. Of course, this brings up multiple issues as a business that we have to consider in terms of risk versus reward. For instance, we normally deliver seed into multiple European countries until as late as May for planting. So if it arrives here in December, it does of course have to go to suitable storage. A number of European countries aren't used to this sort of storage. They will receive the seeds in seed packaging, which is traditionally polypropylene bags or Hessian sacks, neither of which are suitable for long-term seed storage. There's of course a cost implication. There's the risk of quality deterioration, and then on top of that, we as BPTA and in the UK trade under the terms of BPTA. When we go further afield, there's a number of other RUSIP type rules that we can trade under that are a minefield, I'm afraid to say. So it's a huge amount of work and a huge amount of discussion that still needs to be completed before we can safely say that we're in a position to see out this season before the transition period ends. I think we also have a habit in seed potato world of falling into the trap that we are the only thing going on at this time of year, especially when it comes to exports. But we have to bear in mind that the rest of the UK's logistics and European logistics are going to be looking for ways and means to beat the Brexit clock and any tariffs and barriers to trade that other products may face. So the logistic requirements is going to be massive. And as you can see, I've noted there, Signet Pep alone, as only one exporter from the UK, is going to need 200 trucks for seed potatoes before Christmas. Now, if you bear in mind that we're now into November and the weather is only going to do one thing in the UK and Scotland in particular, and that's get colder, the last thing we can afford is to have ill-equipped logistical programs for delivering our seed potatoes and the value and the quality degradation that can be associated with that. So we're really looking at 200 trucks of very specialised equipment to get just my seed potatoes from Signet Pep out to Europe. So multiply that up several times over all the exporters, and you can see the conundrum that's ahead of us. Then on top of that, we have to consider what we're going to do pre-Christmas with high-grade seed. Do we want to start supplying high-grade input seed into the European Union? Do we want to move out stocks of seed that would normally be multiplied for future years into the EU? Or do we hold on to that and run the risk of what we do in 2021 when it comes to planting? Short-term plans, there are many, and I'm afraid to say it's a very moving target at this moment in time. So if we move on to the next slide. Longer term, yeah, of course, again, it's a bit of a tongue-in-cheek image there of the guy surfing the Union Jack and trying to work out what he's going to be doing next. But the key to longer term Brexit assurances is gaining third country equivalence for the UK. It's an essential process in my mind. It's an essential process for Signet Pep and for the whole of the UK potato industry. For sure, trading with third country equivalents is going to bring us challenges of tariffs, be them WTO or other that are agreed in any deal or no deal scenario. Phytosanitary requirements, plant passports, etc., means an additional set of paperwork, an additional set of traceability that we don't currently have to supply, that will be passed down through the logistical chain all the way back to primary producer to the truck driver that's delivering our seed. But to be perfectly frank, these are all issues that are not insurmountable. These are already things that as seed exporters in Scotland, we're pretty specialised at as it is anyway. I mean, we do export around about 100,000 tonnes of seed potatoes from Scotland annually outside of the European Union that require all these documents anyway. But for sure, it is something that the customer, the end user, may not be aware of and may not fully understand why suddenly they're receiving these mountains of paperwork with their seed potatoes, and who do they have to present them to, and ultimately who do the ministries of agriculture in the destination country, who is going to take responsibility for processing that paperwork and the costs that are involved. So it puts us at a bit of a competitive disadvantage, but as I say, if we had third country equivalents, it would help me sleep much better at night knowing that we can continue our trade going forward. There is, of course, also the risk of other trade deals that the UK government decide to place us into, be that with North America or USA, and the potential for the change to our standards and our potential third country equivalence application being put in jeopardy because of this. We're going to have a long think with our growers in conjunction as to what we do with planting 2021. Is equivalence going to be achieved before we put the seed in the ground? If not, is it going to be done before the seed's harvested or before we need to ship them at the beginning of 2022? There's a huge risk versus rewards discussion to be had there, and it's something that is very much in our mind's eye at this moment in time. On top of that, there are a number of European Union specific varieties grown in Scotland and grown across the UK for customers. The same thing applies to these, and then thirdly, in the same sense as the access to secondary markets. At the moment, anyone involved in seed exports knows that we're working tooth and nail, really working hard to get a large tonnage of seed out to North Africa and the Middle East, which are very, very difficult markets to hit in terms of skin finish quality and phytosanitary requirements. But one thing we have always had in the back pocket is a secondary market into the EU where the customers are willing and able under the current regulations to accept a slightly less high quality product in terms of things such as common scab. That of course disappears overnight with no third country equivalents and no access to the European Union. So we really need to make our plans accordingly as to how we manage that risk within our own business, as do all the other exporters. There are, of course, a number of new opportunities that could come out of Brexit, as I've said, if we move into trade deals with other territories. The ones that seem to make the press more often than not are the USA, Canada, Australasia, New Zealand, Japan. But I think we have to ask ourselves some serious questions as seed producers and exporters as to whether these are markets that we can actually see Scottish seed making an impact in. Are they already seed producing nations? Is there an opportunity there for us to access these countries with our proprietary varieties in particular? Of course, we're then open to the reverse, and let's not kid ourselves on. We know that some of our near neighbours and current customers are looking at Brexit as an opportunity for their seed industries as it stands just now to really reinvigorate and reinvent themselves if the Scottish and UK seed is not going to be landing on their shores. They perhaps are looking at the opportunity to rebuild their own seed industry to maintain their domestic requirements. So for every new opportunity, there is, of course, a new threat within there. Of course, there's the ongoing EU trade deals that we have with major exporting countries such as Egypt and Morocco, which the UK government are in the process of trying to reciprocate with these countries, and hopefully that means that as a seed exporter, I'll be able to continue to trade with them tariff-free. But in the meantime, until anything is confirmed, we have to build in this additional tariff costs to anything that we plan to sell in 2021 outside of the European Union, where we don't have a trade deal agreed. Then moving on, just finally, as Patrick said at the beginning, I am also BPTA president. BPTA, I'd guess most attending the webinar today are members or affiliated in one way or another. So just really very brief statement or brief bit of background as to what BPTA are doing in terms of Brexit engagement. We're in direct communication with DEFRA, in particular Andy Mitchell and his team. Gerard Croft, our secretary, has worked alongside Andy in his professional capacity for a number of years, and we have a very good working relationship where we can pick up the phone or drop them an email and have a fairly quick response. That was shown pretty well recently with a cross-sector trade association collaboration letter that we sent to DEFRA regarding the import extension that I touched on earlier on. That was sent by BPTA and directly to Andy, and it seems to have had a good timing and landed very well with the ministers within DEFRA, and has allowed us to get this 6-month extension for the import of European seed. BPTA also hold a Europatat membership, which is a Brussels-based European association for the trade of potatoes. It gives us access to their expertise who sit in Brussels, and also to the wider European associations. We're consistently and constantly communicating with our members. Gerard today has circulated a bit of a Brexit update regarding the 6-month extension and a few other things that are going on in the background, encouraging any member that we have that has legitimate and useful contacts within the EU to try to lobby to gain us an extension or gain us a bit of a foothold in terms of extending our access to the European market beyond the transition period. And of course, we are involved in wider discussions with other EU trade associations. We're not just speaking to Europatat, we are trying to engage with a number of other trade associations at individual state level. So, yeah, I don't think I've been much other than negative, unfortunately, in my presentation. What I do want to reiterate is this is an ongoing process, and we are pushing really hard to make sure that we get out of this in 2020 and we move on in 2021 with our third country equivalence application. We've got a long, hard 8 to 10 weeks ahead of us before the end of the year, but for sure I know that the very sophisticated and integrated Scottish seed industry in particular will work together on this. We have this fantastic story that we don't sell hard enough in Scotland, where we have at the top of the tree SASA, who are the ones that certify our seed potatoes, all the way down to the growers and everyone in between, be that individual, independent science associations such as JHI and SRUC, as well as all of our very experienced exporting companies. So It's going to be a challenging 10 weeks if we head towards the no deal cliff edge, but for sure, I think after that, the positive spin is if we can get the third country equivalence application really lobbied hard and pushed forward, that's the way forward for all of us as exporters. I think Patrick wants to come back in now, but if there's any questions, I'll be happy to try and answer them.
Sandy, that was really good. Thank you very much. Very insightful presentation. Yeah, I've got a couple of questions that have come in. The first one is looking ahead to the planning for the 2021 season. What will be the timeline for engaging with your grower network and making final decisions on planting varieties, etc., for the European market?
Yeah, I briefly touched on that and didn't give a great deal of detail. In a normal circumstance, Patrick, we'd look to be doing that round about now, but without actually tying things up probably till the start of the new year. Everyone is very much flat out producing shipments for export at the moment, so it's difficult to have meaningful conversations. But realistically, as we head towards the middle of this month and as negotiations continue or otherwise between the EU and UK negotiating teams, we're going to have to start having these conversations in the next 2 or 3 weeks. At some point, we're going to have to decide what we do with our F1 and F2 seed, our high generation seed, if we take the risk and retain it in Scotland, or if we load it all out to our customers and say thank you for the business, but we're now going to have to start again. That, as I said in the presentation, is a 3 to 4 year process. So I'm reluctant to give up the access to the market for as long as that. But of course, it all hinges on third country equivalence and whether that application goes through swiftly or not.
Okay. And a question from Mike Abram. What would be the key challenges to your business if we do get third country equivalence? What would be the change from pre-Brexit planning as it currently stands?
So third country equivalence gives us access to the market. What it doesn't mean is a free trade agreement. So it depends very much upon what sort of Brexit we have. Under a hard Brexit, and we get third country equivalence, we'll trade under WTO rules. That is what I believe to be the case. If we have a Brexit deal, it very much depends what that deal looks like. But one thing we need to sort of reiterate is that even a Brexit deal doesn't mean we have third country equivalence. It means that the process of applying for that equivalence, in my mind, should be much more straightforward. But it doesn't mean that overnight that a Brexit deal means that we can trade freely immediately. I think the equivalence will still need to be there. So to answer the question again, it's going to be paperwork, red tape, and potentially tariffs is going to be the challenge once we achieve the equivalence conversation.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much again for the presentation. And what we'll do now, Sandy, is we'll pass over to Emily. And Emily will be telling us about EU exit on international trade and the planning steps and the planning for the end of the transition period. So Emily, over to you. Thank you.
Hi everyone, many thanks AHDB for giving me a chance to talk to you all today, and hopefully this will be a useful conversation. So as Patrick said, I'm EU Exit and International Trade Advisor for the NFU, and I'm going to do a bit of an overview of kind of what we can expect over the next few months, what will the practicalities of trade look like, what the NFU is doing, and kind of some things to think about. But I'll start with just kind of saying where we are in the EU-UK negotiations. So obviously there's been quite a lot of noise in the last few weeks of kind of, it sounds though the UK was maybe walking away or kind of taking a hard line, and the EU is maybe putting a bit more pressure on the UK to make concessions. But ultimately what we have seen is both sides have come back to the table and negotiations have intensified. And so really the next kind of week or so is really going to be critical. We've obviously in Brexit, it feels like every deadline has been missed, but the deadline that's certainly at the moment is kind of mid-November in order to give time for the ratification of any deal. So what we can expect to see over the next week or so will be really interesting. But currently both sides are in intensified talks. They're in the tunnel, as it's called, and you know, kind of in a way, the fact that we're not seeing much in the news means that they're really kind of working hard. So it's sort of a watch this space. I think the question I get asked the most is, will there be a deal or not? And you know, my crystal ball does not go that far, but we'll certainly have to see. And they are still talking, negotiations are still underway. Next slide, please. So just kind of thinking about what are the key risks and what's kind of happening at this stage. There's for a long time it's sort of been deal, no deal, and kind of deal might be the thing that fixes everything, and obviously no deal comes with a lot of risks, but actually there is a lot of change coming irrespective of the outcome of the negotiations, which are very much focused on that free trade, tariff and quota free access. So in a no deal, as Sandy's already pointed out, obviously trading with the EU on WTO terms, and that's where tariffs come into play. Actually as well, it says their equivalency, SPS restrictions and other barriers to trade. These are not subject to the negotiations, but certainly everything is made a lot easier if we have a deal. So a deal does mitigate some of the effects and does kind of give a smoother process. But in a deal or no deal, we are going to see more technical restrictions on EU trade, and there is of course the risk of disruption and delay at the borders, and that's where particularly I think the example that stands out here is the talk around kind of 7,000 lorries queued up in Kent, and several days worth of delay. It's worth saying the NFU pushed really hard for all perishable agri-food products to be prioritised in those exports, because obviously the last thing we want is goods just kind of rotting and deteriorating in a queue. But currently that's not the case, but still something we're pushing hard for, and equally looking at how we can mitigate some of that disruption for imports, which I'm going to come on to. So next slide, please. I'm going to talk about equivalence in a bit more detail further on. So I'm now just going to assume we do have equivalence. What are the other issues we can think about? And obviously Sandy has covered off equivalence really well. So thinking about import, like I say, tariffs and customs declarations, if we don't have a deal, will be a major concern. Tariffs on potato imports, so seed potatoes, it's a 4% tariff. On fresh potatoes, it's 8 to 10% depending on variety. Frozen potatoes up to 14%. Equally, on the export side, there will be EU tariffs on any of our exports without a deal. Again, assuming we can export them, and those are largely comparable. So 4.5% on seed potatoes, up to around 14% on fresh or new potatoes and frozen potatoes. So thinking about that kind of cost increase and the impacts there. What we will see on the import side, and I'm going to talk about the phased-in approach for border operations for imports, but that is going to be a delayed customs declaration procedure. So for the first 6 months, imports will not need to have a customs declaration. Obviously, exporting into the EU, there will need to be a customs declaration. But this is again more of that kind of paperwork, more of that logistical ask on your time and business efforts in that import. And then as well with that, added inspection burdens, other added logistics, more paperwork. So again, I'll go into this in a bit more detail, but thinking about what phytosanitary certificates will be needed to import and export, what other plant health requirements may need to be met, what is the inspection frequency, either way. And as again, I think Sandy has alluded to, this will also affect anything moving into Northern Ireland. So the island of Ireland is being treated as a single phytosanitary zone. So from a plant health perspective, it will have the same controls on it as any exports moving from GB into the EU, as well as GB into Northern Ireland. And movements on the island of Ireland will move as though they're part of that EU market from a phytosanitary perspective. Movements, obviously the big line for movements from Northern Ireland into GB is all around unfettered market access, so allowing goods to move as freely as they do now. But these are all the kind of key concerns I would be thinking about, or I am thinking about, for the potato sector. So next slide, please. So kind of getting under the skin of how the border is going to operate in a bit more detail. You may have seen the government published its border operating model in October, and this went into a bit more detail on the phased approach for imports, which can be phased in over a 6-month period. But the key ones really are from the 1st of January, because that captures all high-risk plants, which will include seed and wear potatoes, and they will need phytosanitary certificates, documentary identity and physical checks. For the first 6 months, those physical checks can take place at a registered point of destination, so they can take place at business, but then they will have to move after that to a border control point. And this will obviously as well, then the customs declarations procedures, as I say, come into force after 6 months. So any tariffs then would come into play, but even without, even if we do have a free trade agreement and no tariffs, you still need to think about your customs procedures and as well thinking about the IT systems to use. So these are all the areas to be thinking about and to be talking to people about, but I will again talk about that a bit more. For exports, the controls are going to apply from day one. So again, phytosanitary certificates, all the documentary identity and physical checks, customs procedures and IT systems. And again, thinking about the routes you're using and thinking about because the goods will need to enter via a border control point, making sure that that is set up to accept your goods. But all of this hinges on us actually being able to export seed and ware potatoes into the EU market. So next slide, please. So as I said, third country equivalent, sorry, next slide, please. Oh, maybe not, well, I'll talk about equivalents anyway. Third country equivalents, like I say, is it's really in the gift of the EU as to whether they afford, they list the country, the UK as a listed third country on equivalents, and that sits outside the negotiations, but as I say, is made much easier if we do have a trade deal. Currently, the UK is not listed, as Sandy has said, but we know the process for those applications is going on, but the latest government guidance has said it will not be in place for the 1st of January. We are really pushing the government to prioritise these equivalency applications. It also affects some other areas in a similar way, but to really kind of prioritise that and make sure that they raise the profile of it within the EU. And this is important, obviously, for EU customers who are buying UK seed and ware potatoes. So those conversations are ongoing. Like I say, the process is happening and it will be made easier if we get a deal. But equally, we know it's a process that can take up to 2 years. And not to sound too negative, but it's only in very specific circumstances that the EU has ever given equivalency on seed potatoes. So it's only Switzerland and I think a very, very specific derogation for Canada on seed potato imports. But then again, we have been safely moving seed potatoes into the EU now. So NFU is really prioritising making sure that any goods that can freely move into the EU market now can continue to move into the EU market in the future. Next slide, please. So as I was saying, what does this mean for Northern Ireland? And Northern Ireland will be treated as part of the same phytosanitary zone as the rest of the EU. So what's that mean for the border? Now, there's a lot of talk about the Northern Ireland Protocol and what that means, but essentially that's managing how goods will move between GB and the island of Ireland and Northern Ireland. So again, like I say, from a plant health perspective, any controls that apply to the EU will also apply to Northern Ireland. Therefore, anything moving from GB into Northern Ireland will require all the same checks and certificates, etc. And then once on the island of Ireland can move freely. Goods moving from Northern Ireland to GB will have unfettered market access. So they should be able to move freely, but there will be some safeguards in there around kind of biosecurity. Equally, what this means is anything that is prohibited for export to the EU is also prohibited for export to the Northern Ireland. And again, that's where it becomes a really big issue for things like seed and ware potatoes. So again, really emphasising that need for goods to be able to move freely. Next slide, please. So I've spoken a bit about what the NFU is doing. Like the BPTA, regular dialogue with DEFRA at all levels. I speak very regularly to their plant health and plant trade teams. And again, throughout the organisation, we are in regular contact with government on these issues. Obviously, working to try and get information out to industry, whether that's taking part in events like this, putting information on NFU online, working with other industry partners to try and help prepare the industry as much as possible. We also have an office in Brussels, and so they are kind of eyes and ears on the ground, talk to European partners and keep us up to date on what's happening there. So things like how are their equivalency negotiation or talks taking place, how are they going? And also through that, we are a member of the European Farmers Organisation, COPA-COGECA. Another big part of the NFU's work, which you'll no doubt have seen, is all around kind of future trade and standards, and kind of, I think chlorinated chicken seems to be the headline, but obviously it applies at all levels and to all agri-food goods. So a really big win for the NFU was the announcement that the Trade and Agriculture Commission will be put on a statutory footing and therefore be able to scrutinise trade deals. So that kind of takes us into what the NFU's priorities are. As I've said, keeping markets open and functional, giving sufficient time for adjustment and supporting businesses in making these adjustments. You know, big changes coming. So with that as well, providing adequate financial support to ensure businesses are able to adapt to the new trading environment we will be in, regardless of the outcomes of the negotiations. Obviously, as well, we've got in there ensuring adequate and appropriate import tariffs are in place. So important making sure that our growers and our farmers and growers in this country are not going to be undercut, but also that they can continue to run their businesses functionally. I've spoken about parliamentary scrutiny for free trade agreements, so really important across all agricultural sectors and making sure that our growers can compete on a level playing field. And with that is robust and timely market monitoring. You know, AHDB do a great job of looking at what's happening in the market for potatoes, thinking about that so that we can manage any disruption and the outcomes of any trade agreements or non-trade agreements to think about what the impact will be. Ensuring that we've got a fit for purpose future immigration system. You know, obviously a lot of talk about seasonal labour in the horticulture sector, but also across all industries, making sure that we can get the people we need with the right skills at the right level to meet the specific requirements of the agri-food sector. And as Sandy talked about, generating new market opportunities and thinking about where can our products really excel. You know, this is a good opportunity for the UK to think about where are those new markets and how can we realise all the opportunities within them. So that's what the NFU is doing, but what can you do as a business? So next slide, please. Now, you will all know your businesses and what the risks are and things. You know your businesses far better than I do. So this is going to be kind of general things to think about. And my number one thing would be risk assess your supply chain. You know, Sandy made a really good point about logistics and the demand on logistics over the next few months. So think about those kind of risks. I would look across your whole supply chain. So think about any inputs, where do they come from? Make sure you're speaking to your supplier. So thinking about any seed, fertilizer, plant protection products, anything like that, and make sure you're speaking to suppliers. And equally, your output, so your crop, where does it go? Who is your customer? Have you spoken to your customer about the new controls and what the requirements will be? Have you looked at your contract and thought about any liability for increased costs? You know, something we see sometimes is a so-called Brexit clause in a contract. That's my sort of colloquial name for it. And it's talking about who's liable for any tariff increases or other increased costs. So think about that. And just think about your pinch points. Think about where there might be delay, where something might be held up, and how can you mitigate that? How can you plan, whether that's getting things in early and in good time, whether it's thinking about your storage capacity, just kind of do that risk assessment across your whole supply chain. And also think about what the market's doing. I'm not a market expert, but we had a great presentation yesterday from AHDB on what is happening in the market for potatoes. So think about what the market's doing. And then also think about what requirements you need to meet. So if you're exporting, you're going to need an EORI number. Think about registration with the necessary authorities and systems, and speak to your plant health inspector. Look, there's loads of information out there, which I know can be maybe a little overwhelming at times, but some good sources are things like the EU Exit Food Hub, which is created by a partnership of agri-food organisations, including the NFU. Obviously, there's NFU Online, there's AHDB website, and of course gov.uk and their announcements. And you will have seen the kind of check, change, go adverts that have been up and around over the last few months. So a lot of places to look for information, but kind of think about what do you need and where's your supply chain perhaps at risk, both downwards and up your supply chain. But I'm going to stop there. But if obviously happy to take any questions, and I'll do my best to answer them.
Emily, thank you very much. Great presentation, and yeah, lots of food for thought there. I've got a couple of questions that have come in specifically for you. One of them is about equivalence. Now, you mentioned that it doesn't hinge on negotiations, but I take it equivalence, if we get a deal, then equivalence, it's better placed to get through rather than a no deal?
Absolutely. You know, it's a technical point, and it's sort of in the gift of the EU whether they give us equivalence, obviously, you know, tied up with meeting all the specific requirements and evidence base. But everything, and this applies to equivalence, but even other issues that sit outside deal, everything becomes easier if we have a deal. You know, if both sides are feeling positive and we've got that negotiation, we've got those grounds, and we're moving forward positively, everything becomes easier. So I would say it is not subject to the negotiations, but it could be mitigated or made easier if we get a deal. So we'll all have to keep our fingers crossed.
Yes, and a question from James Bulford. Could you confirm that if the UK government gets a deal with the EU, and if part of that deal is immediate phyto or third country equivalence, will exporters still be required to organise phytosanitary inspections, certificates for shipments, or will it revert to business as usual?
So it's a really good question. We will still need to do those phytosanitary certificate and other controls and inspections. So like I say, that kind of border operation will come into force regardless of a deal or no deal. The deal is almost very much focused on tariffs and quota-free access, whereas, you know, these other technical aspects sit outside a deal. But again, what might be made easier is that we may see a reduced frequency of checks. We may not, you know, there's many shades of deal that we could see coming out if we get a deal at all. But we may see things like a reduced frequency of checks, and everything might be made a little bit smoother, and some of those impacts might be mitigated. But I think all of those things are some of the few things we do know are coming, regardless of the outcomes. So I would absolutely advise everyone to look at that and think about those requirements. There are a lot of unknowns at this stage, equivalency being number one unknowns, but some of the things we do know, so have a look at those and think about that. There is the border operating model. It is a hefty document, but if you can look at your specific sections within that to think about how imports and exports might work.
Okay. Great, Emily, thank you very much. Some other questions come through, but we'll keep them to the final Q&A panel at the end. So thank you. David, next slide, please. So I'm just going to sort of cover over the appropriate steps that people should be considering for now. Next slide, please. So as has already been mentioned, and again, probably no need to tell everybody on the call about this, but the UK have left the EU, and the transition period will end on the 31st of December 2020. I think the main take-home message is, and I think Emily's pretty much said it, that there will be changes regardless of whether you're exporting or importing. It will not be as it was before. So I think everyone needs to take heed of that and pay attention and pay reference to the various different websites, etc. That change is coming, and it will impact. Next slide, please, David. So we talked about third country. Third country has been talked about a lot today, but third country does refer to any country outside the EU and its economic structures. Businesses in a third country have to fill in custom declaration whether there is a trade agreement or not. And the EU has a formal list of third countries that are approved for food imports, and as Emily's pointed out, Switzerland's on that list for seed potatoes. But it's mainly about sanitary and phytosanitary measures and making sure that they meet the basic standard for sale in the single market. DEFRA have applied for third country listing in a range of commodities, and the decision, as has been pointed out today, it sits with the EU. Next slide, please. So as of the 1st of January 2021, high priority plants such as seed potatoes and ware potatoes from the EU must have a phytosanitary certificate, a pre-notification submitted by the importer in England, Wales, Scotland or Wales, and documentary and identity checks and a physical inspection. Now, further steps will be required from April onwards and further steps again from 1st of July onwards. But the guidance that indicates that GB importers must notify AFA about movements or future movements. The main take-home message from this is that AFA are still working on the guidelines in terms of how this will be managed and carried out beyond January, and subsequently from July next year, all imports or all checks of import goods will take place at a border control post, and that will be the difference. There will be other IT systems that people will have to adhere to and sign up to, but again, we're still waiting for clarity on a lot of these issues. Next slide, please, David. So, as was mentioned, ministers from all 4 administrations yesterday agreed that EU seed will continue to be marketable in England and Wales for 6 months from the 1st of January 2020. Now, the word there is marketable. We can clarification whether that's marketable or whether that includes the sale of imports from the EU. The assumption is that it does include market and sale of imports, but that needs clarification. So in effect, the UK are recognising EU certification as equivalence for the next 6 months. The varieties will need to be on the GB or the NI variety list. The UK national list will become separate, so there'll be a GB and an NI variety list from the 1st of January, and from the all varieties from the UK national list will be on each variety list from the 31st of December. New plant health controls will apply also from the 1st of January. Next slide, please. Exporting potatoes to the EU, as you've heard from Sandy and Emily, the UK is not included in the 3rd country list as of yet. Therefore, if nothing changes, UK exports of seed potatoes and ware potatoes to the EU will not be permitted. So UK exporters, as Sandy has already pointed out, should consider sending shipments prior to the 1st of January, although logistically that may be a challenge. Next slide, please. Now, there are things that you can be doing in the background. As and when we get equivalence is another matter, but there are bits and pieces that you can line up in advance of that. And one of them is an EORI number, or an economic operator registration and identification number. This is a unique ID code for businesses and is issued by HMRC. It's required to move goods between the UK and the EU. The EORI number will start with GB and be followed by a 12-digit number, and you can apply it online at this following address. I will make sure that I send this presentation round to everyone after the webinar, because there are a few clickable links that will take you through to the various different websites. It can take up to 5 working days to get an EORI number, so the sooner that you get it, the better. No EORI number displayed on goods could mean that your goods are held up by customs, and a EORI number is required whether you're shipping by sea, land, or air freight. Next slide, please. Emily mentioned border control posts, and these are designed a designated and approved inspection posts at European Union borders to carry out checks on products arriving from 3rd countries. To export goods from GB to the EU, you will need to enter through a dedicated border control post, and that is designated for and can check and process the types of goods. A list of the EU BCPs can be found on the European Commission website through the following link, and this is obviously likely to be updated prior to the end of the transition period. You need to check that the intended border control post can process your goods and how much notice they will require for goods arriving at the BCP. The point here is that not all border control posts will receive all goods. They will have various different areas of specialities, and therefore it's important that you double check to make sure that the border control posts you would normally use or intend to use can actually process your goods. Next slide, please. This slide's just based on the EU importers or based importers. EU-based importers is the person who would legally receive your goods upon reception in the EU. They don't necessarily have to be in the place of the destination, they just need to be based in the EU. The goods need to be checked, as I've mentioned, at a border control post, and all border control posts will require advance notice of the goods arriving, and it will be your import agent that would submit the pre-notification of goods at the border control post, and they will make their importer's declaration at that stage. Next slide, please. Just a couple of final points. Customs declarations. From January 1st, 2021, exporters have to submit export declaration of all goods, submit safety and security information either via a combined export declaration or a standalone exit summary declaration. Now, you can make the custom declaration yourselves, or you can hire someone else to do this for you. And again, that's something to consider coming up to the end of the transition period. Custom processes are complicated and require specific training and software. So most businesses use custom intermediaries to complete customs processes for them. And again, there's a link there to some guidance where you can provide some assistance in terms of how to make that happen. Next slide, please. And the final slide is really on tariffs. Again, we're still waiting confirmation and clarity, but you may need to pay tariffs to export or import goods into the UK. Goods require a commodity code, and you can use the following UK trade tariff tool to find the correct commodity code. There are further details on exporting in general through the following link as well. So there's loads of different government information out there. What I will say at this stage is that I have spoken to DEFRA. There will be quite a substantial webinar and training protocol that will take place in the run up to the end of the transition period. It's already taking place for products of animal origin. The training and the sort of rollout of the guidance on plant health will be coming in the next few weeks. There's new IT systems and that need to be compatible, so they're being tested at the moment, being piloted at the moment, and once that's all gone through, the training is likely to be rolled out in the next couple of weeks. Okay, next slide, please, David. If I could invite all our panelists back in, and if I could invite Tania and Sarah to join us as well. Thank you very much. And I will just go into the questions that have been filing in as we've been going. We have a question from Phil Gray on who would need the EORI number. Would that be the merchant or the grower? Is anyone able to answer that?
I'll have a go. So it's the exporting party, so whoever is exporting. Obviously, if you're if you have hauliers who actually undertake the physical act of exporting, they're not the exporter, they're the haulier, but it is the exporting party. So if you sell on to another company and they then export, it would be them as the exporter. But if you're exporting direct to a customer in the EU, it would be you, is my understanding.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Emily. I think if it's the Phil Gray I'm thinking of, that's generally going to speak, that's going to be your merchant, Phil.
Okay, Emily, maybe a question directed to you or Tania maybe, but does third-party equivalence apply to sweet potatoes? In other words, are we banned from supplying them to Northern Ireland or the Republic of Ireland from the 1st of January? So not seed, not ware, but sweet potatoes.
Gosh, this is a good test of my Latin and my plant varieties. So it's all done on the listed varieties. I'm happy to take away and look specifically at seed potatoes, and if they're one of the listed prohibited plants, but it is all tubers of practicing my Latin now, Solanaceae. So I think seed potatoes, sweet potatoes even fall under that, but it might take more of a botanist to advise on that.
Okay, and just a sort of a clarification point for everyone that's on the webinar just now is, if we're not in a position to answer the questions directly, we will take them away. We will get answers for you, and we will circulate them around to everybody that's been on the webinar once we have the answers. Okay, on to another question. Sandy, more about the trade deals. Now, you mentioned North America, you mentioned Canada, you mentioned sort of Australia, New Zealand, the ones that are currently in negotiation, the ones that we're hearing of from the UK government. I mean, do you think there's any opportunities in those particular markets for seed potatoes and for potatoes in general?
Without wanting to be particularly negative, my gut feeling is no. Most of these markets that we've discussed have got fairly mature potato markets of their own. They've got very sort of mature and developed seed markets in particular. I think the strength of what we do as seed exporters lies in the high health status of what we do, and it's going to challenging markets where there's harsher, more challenging, difficult growing conditions, where the high quality and high health and low virus nature of Scottish seed and UK seed in general is something that the customer wants. So I don't think any of those markets we've mentioned really suffer greatly in that respect. In fact, I would almost flip it 180 and say that the challenge at the moment should be for UK government and those, perhaps even yourself, Patrick, to be sure that we're going to maintain our market share of the current markets, in particular where we are in North Africa and the Middle East, and then through a period of uncertainty, rather than looking to spread our wings, we want to be sure we secure what we already have.
Okay, thank you. Emily, Tania, maybe a double act on this one. It's sort of been covered yesterday and today as well, but again, it's a question being asked, so it's worthwhile sort of paying more attention to it. So if we get a deal, this will provide tariff-free access, or it could provide tariff-free access to the EU market, but we will still need third country equivalents. If we don't get a deal, can we still apply for third country equivalents? And if awarded, could we trade and have to pay tariffs?
Yeah, I don't know if Emily wants to go first, but I would say yes. I mean, if we get the equivalence, then we get the access to the market. So if we have a trade deal which ensures zero tariff, zero quota access to the EU market, then we get access to the EU and we don't have to pay tariffs. Whereas if we get the equivalence but no deal, then we will get access to the market, but we will have to pay tariffs, the EU's external tariff.
Yeah, I'd completely agree with what Tania said. One's about market access, actually having the access, so that's equivalence, and the other's about having easier access, which is about tariff-free. Yeah.
Okay, another question. Have COPA published a position specific to potatoes and a deal or no deal risks? Emily?
Tania may have the answer, but otherwise I'm very happy to go back to our Brussels office and find out that they're our point of contact with COPA. But equally, Sandy or Tania may have more information there.
Yeah, to be honest, I'm not aware of any COPA position specific on potatoes, but yeah, I again, as we always say, we can check and come back with a specific answer for this one.
Yeah, that's great. Well, we will circulate that afterwards. Tania, one question that was raised yesterday on the Northern Ireland Protocol. Is it possible for you to explain why the protocol was agreed in the first place and how it's going to be implemented in practice?
Yeah, sure. So in a general way, the protocol of Northern Ireland was introduced in an aim to kind of strike a right balance between the need to preserve the peace and stability in the island of Ireland avoiding a hard border between the North and the Republic, and at the same time preserving the integrity of the single market. So yeah, with that aim in our minds, what we've done is we've moved the border from the island to the Irish Sea. So now the border between the EU and the UK is in the Irish Sea. So this is kind of the solution to this problem that we had that arose when the UK decided to leave the EU. Now, the implementation of the protocol, as you can imagine, doing this is a very complex process. And the implementation is something that is, the practical arrangements for the implementation is something that is being worked out by the two sides. But there is a body, the EU-UK Joint Committee, that is in charge of overseeing how this protocol is implemented in practice. And well, this joint committee is meeting regularly, and one of the last meetings took place a couple of weeks ago. And as per the conclusions, the reality is that the EU raised some concerns as regards the state of play of these preparations to put it into practice. So obviously it's an ongoing process, but it doesn't really look very positive in the way that there need to be some solutions, and those solutions have not been found yet. However, as I say, work ongoing. This joint committee will be meeting regularly, so having a look on the conclusions after each meeting is a way of keeping more or less updating on how it is, what's the latest state of play. So there will be another meeting of this joint committee this month probably, and we'll see how it is going. And I don't know if maybe Emily wants to add anything else, but yeah, this is as much as we can say at the moment, because indeed it's work in progress.
Well, I have a specific question for Emily anyway, on the back of that. So thank you, Tania. Emily, it was raised yesterday that a scenario where you would have a product going into Northern Ireland prior to the 31st of December. And it would then, if a product is in Northern Ireland, once it's in Northern Ireland, would it have free movement into the Republic of Ireland after the 1st of January? It seemed to be in what you were saying earlier, that alluding to that the island of Ireland would sort of been seen as a single market in its own right. So therefore, I'm just sort of double checking, would that be the case?
So generally my understanding is goods that are in circulation prior to the 1st of January are subject to existing controls, so the exact same controls as we have now. It's goods that come into circulation after the well, midnight on the 31st of December 2020. Obviously that could change sort of if the product has changed in some way. So if it's, you know, this obviously doesn't apply so much to seed potatoes, but if some other products say it's been processed and it's been changed in a way, or if, and therefore it needs to be labelled or marketed differently. Again, can take that one to DEFRA and try and get a kind of concrete answer, but my general understanding is goods that are in circulation prior to the 1st of January don't have the new controls on them.
Okay, thank you. Just a final call out to anyone on the webinar that has a question. I'm shortly going to be wrapping up the question, so if you've got any final questions, please submit them. Sandy, just a final question really for you. You mentioned about logistics and the fact that you're looking for a huge number of hauls to the EU potentially before the end of the year. Obviously the haulage companies and the transportation have going to have their own set of rules and documentation that they will need to follow after the new year as well. So I take it it's important for businesses to be speaking to their hauliers and having good relationship with hauliers and making sure that there's open lines of communication moving ahead.
Yeah, I mean, there are fairly specialist companies out there, Patrick, that handle most of the logistics into the EU, as there are those that handle logistics from Scotland down to England and vice versa. these guys have been very proactive. There's one or two in particular that have been sending out fairly regular mail shots to customers, a number of us in the seed potato trade, detailing what steps they're taking, and even as recently as yesterday, one company sent out details of a new department they've opened up, an export logistics department. So everyone's making plans, everyone's moving ahead with this, but of course there are very few segments of industry, and then if you drill down further, agriculture, that face the cliff edge that we're facing. So yeah, we're under this extreme time pressure with a no deal scenario of 31st December and the end of the transition period. Others maybe don't face quite as dramatically. Getting granted, yeah, there may be tariffs, etc., and phytosanitary conditions to meet, but unfortunately our market disappears then. So yeah, speak to your hauliers, make sure people are aware. I certainly put the wind up our main logistics guys last week when I said I wanted 200 trucks loaded on the 20th of December and finished by the 31st, which was firmly tongue in cheek, but yeah, it's a major undertaking over the next 8 weeks that these guys have.
Okay, great, thank you. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions coming in, so what I'd like to do at this point is to thank you all for your time today. A really good list of presentations, very different from yesterday, and it was really good to get sort of a different sort of a perspective from the NFU, and Sandy from Signet PEP and BPTA. That was really insightful, so thank you very much for that. Just a reminder to everyone else that, next slide, David, please. So we have been producing a Brexit countdown document. If you would like to receive further communications on this countdown document, please contact my colleague Mag Skinner, and Mag's email address is margaret.skinner@ahdb.org.uk. Next slide, please. There are a few future events to take note of. We have another webinar, an AHDB-wide webinar coming up on the 12th of November. Tania, I think you're on that one, are you? No, sorry, wrong. There's a 12th of November webinar, Leaving the EU Change is Coming. We have the Potato Industry Conference 2020 taking place on the 24th of November, a virtual conference. But all our webinars and a whole list of webinars are available on the the AHDB events webpage, as well as access to previous webinars that have taken place over the past few weeks. You will also shortly receive a feedback form, and we would really appreciate if you could take your time to complete this. It is a very short form, and all information received is invaluable, and feedback is great. So if you could please fill that out, that would be fantastic. And again, again, thank you all for joining us today and listening to our panel. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much, and goodbye.